The question is, how did we manage to sell Sophia Andruchovych's Amadoka so widely and make it one of the books of the fair at the London Book Fair in April. To begin with, the window for translated literature, period, abroad is always relatively small relative to local markets. But in this case, I think it was a confluence of various factors. I noticed since the escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine that there was a general uptick in interest in Ukrainian culture abroad. But what was missing, or what there was suddenly a scramble for, were sort of what we would call scouts or local experts who could indicate, these are the top titles that you need to look for. I know that there were, Ukrainian Book Institute and Xenia Tompkins and Halt, and there were various organizations that over the last few years had been working to prepare materials to make Ukrainian literature more legible and to present it abroad. And even so, the window for the kinds of books that can sort of take off in the way that Amadoka is very, 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 very small. My mother is from Kyiv, and she had been reading Sophia's novel, Felix Austria, and fell in love with the book and said, this is a writer you should really pay attention to. And so I went on a bit of a goose chase, and I got in touch with Ivan, who's the rights manager at Starый Lev, at Old Lion, and proposed to Ivan, why don't I select a few of the sort of top literary authors and the publishing house and represent those rights internationally. And so that was right before the London Book Fair. And so what we encountered there was that Ivan had a whole catalog and materials that he had meticulously prepared, and that I was able to look at that catalog and think, what are really the books that could travel, as it were. And in the case of Amadoka, it felt like it was clear to me that this was a bona fide literary voice. This was an author who was quite established in Ukraine, and that it was a book that was incredibly ambitious in scope, not least because of its length, 800 pages, but that it presented an entire 20th century sort of broad cultural and socio-political backdrop as a way of better understanding and enriching a foreign reader's conception of the current situation in Ukraine. It also was meaningful that it was a book that was written before this current escalation of war, which is to say that it obviously has a political poignancy, but its breadth of scope was such that for a reader in Spain or in the US who probably can't even locate Ukraine on a map, this was a broad enough and ambitious enough and human-driven enough story that it could be a kind of introduction to Ukrainian literature and culture and the nuances of the socio-political situation. And it was just crazy enough to take on. Sometimes to make a book break out internationally, there are different reasons some books stand out as opposed to others. But to submit an 800-page Ukrainian novel that most editors couldn't read 48 hours before the London Book Fair was just crazy enough to get people's attention, and that's exactly what we did. So 24 hours. What helped? The other things that helped. There was Ivan had already sold the German rights to Residenz Verlag, so there was a German translation of the first part of the novel. The Germans decided to, the Austrian publisher decided to break Amadoka into a trilogy because it's written in 3 parts, and so they're publishing it. That's the first thing a foreign publisher has to think is, okay, this book might work in our market, but how do we best publish it? So they decided to publish it as a trilogy. So we had the first part translated into German, and so the international scouts, many of whom read German, were able to read it, some of them overnight. So in less than 24 hours, we had a preempt in France, And that kind of ignited the flames so that by the Saturday on the eve of the London Book Fair, we had sold it in France and in Spain. And then we had auctions in almost all of the Nordic countries. And sometimes that's all it takes. And a book fair is a useful tool for creating a sense of urgency around a project, which is harder to do when you're remote. So I would say that it's also a testament to the value of the book fairs, to the value of being plugged into an international apparatus of book scouts, of editors who talk to one another and say, have you heard about this Ukrainian novel? And it was nice. By the third day of the London Book Fair, people were asking us, are you the one with this big Ukrainian novel? This is crazy, what's going on? And so some of it is just hype, but it's particularly meaningful when the thing that you're hyping is substantive and urgent and so clearly singular that everything sort of lined up in a kind of fortuitous way.